Okay, good day everybody. Welcome to our next episode of the Dissection of the Human Brain. I'm Dr. Sanjay Sanyal, Professor and Course-Director of Neuroscience, and the camera person is Mr. Mark Lessard, our IT Administrator. Today I shall demonstrate all that we need to know about the cerebellum. So what you see in front of you, which I'm holding, this is the cerebellum attached to the brainstem. First, let me give you a quick overview of how the structures are disposed. This is the medulla, this is the pons, and this is part of the midbrain. The rest of the midbrain has been removed while it was being removed from this cadaver. And if you notice that this is the anterior part, and stuck to the dorsal aspect of the posterior part of the brainstem is the cerebellum here. This whole thing is the cerebellum. So therefore, the cerebellum is attached to the dorsal aspect of the pons and the medulla. So this is the orientation of the cerebellum in the lateral view. This is the orientation of the cerebellum in the anterior view. And this is the view of the cerebellum from the posterior aspect. Now that we have seen the orientation of the cerebellum, now let's see how the cerebellum is located in situ in the cranial cavity. For that, I need to show you the cranial cavity itself. This is the base of the skull, and this is the posterior cranial fossa. You can see the cerebellum is located here. The cerebellum sits like this. Therefore, this depression that you see in the posterior cranial fossa, these are known as the cerebellar fossa. And this groove that you see, this is where the tentorium cerebelli is attached. So therefore, this is the infratentorial compartment which houses the cerebellum. This is the foramen magnum through which this medulla passes out. So this is the orientation of the cerebellum. So now that we have seen how the cerebellum is disposed in the cranial cavity, we understand immediately something. The cerebellum is like a thick disc. It has got a superior surface. It has got an inferior surface. The superior surface is the one which is separated from the occipital lobe of the brain by the tentorium cerebelli. So therefore, the tentorium cerebelli is here. And the inferior surface, this is the inferior surface, which is the one which is resting on the posterior cranial fossa, infratentorial compartment, or the cerebellar fossa. In fact, if you look at the cranial cavity much more closely, you might see some grooves on the floor. Those are known as the brain markings caused by the cerebellar grooves. In this particular specimen, they are not so obvious. So this is the orientation of the cerebellum. Now let's take a look at the parts of the cerebellum. The cerebellum has got two hemispheres. We are looking at the cerebellum from the posterior aspect. So this is one hemisphere, this is one hemisphere. And joining the two hemispheres, we have a midline structure which you can see here. This is the vermis. Now, quite often students have asked me this question: is the vermis like the corpus callosum of the brain? No. The simple answer is the vermis is not like the corpus callosum of the brain. The vermis is got the same structure as the cerebellar hemispheres. Only thing is it has got less of the cortex matter, which we shall see a little later. It is not like the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum, on the other hand, is a thick sheet of white matter which joins the two cerebral hemispheres. So therefore, vermis is not the same as the corpus callosum. Now let's take a look at the surface and the appearance of the cerebellum. For the sake of description, what I have done, I have removed the pia mater. Otherwise, the pia mater is the one which covers the surface and which has all the blood vessels. And therefore, unfortunately, by removing it, we have also had to remove the blood vessels. But we immediately notice that the cerebral surface has got multiple grooves. The purpose of this is to increase the surface area of the cerebellar cortex. And each individual structure fold that you see here, they are referred to as the cerebellar folia. The single purpose is to increase the surface area of the cortex. And as a result of this, the cerebellum, though it is tightly packed in such a small compartment in the posterior cranial fossa, it has got more number of neurons than the cerebrum, which was contrary to what was known earlier. In fact, the word cerebellum means little brain. Previously, it was thought that it's a small brain, it's a little brain, it's silent brain, but now as more and more research is being done, it's being realized that the cerebellum, in fact, perhaps is even as important, if not more important, than the cerebrum itself. Okay, that's so much for research. Now let's take a look at the fissures and the lobes, the anatomical lobes of the cerebellum. If we look at the posterior border of the cerebellum, the one which is butting against the occipital bone, The posterior border, there is a horizontal fissure here. So this is the horizontal fissure. We can see it clearly here. This is the horizontal fissure. It's a very deep fissure. And this horizontal fissure runs on the posterior aspect, and it divides the cerebellum into a superior surface and an inferior surface, which we have already alluded to. So this is the horizontal, the fissure. Now let's take a look at the superior surface. We see a V-shaped fissure here. This fissure here. This V-shaped fissure divides the cerebellum into a V-shaped anterior anatomical lobe, and the rest of the cerebellum, partly on the superior surface and partly on the inferior surface. The whole thing is referred to as the posterior lobe. Some books also call it the middle lobe. So this is the anterior anatomical lobe. This is the posterior or the middle lobe, which extends from the superior surface to the inferior surface. And finally, I'm going to turn the cerebellum over like this and turn it around like this. We see another fissure deep here. To show you better, this fissure. This fissure. This is known as the uvulonodular fissure. And this demarcates one small lobe of the cerebellum, which is referred to as the flocculonodular lobe. Then this is the flocculonodular lobe. So to repeat, superior surface, we have the primary fissure, anterior anatomical lobe, the middle or the posterior lobe, and finally on the inferior surface, anteriorly, we have the uvulonodular fissure demarcating the flocculonodular lobe. So these are the anatomical lobes of the cerebellum. Now, traditionally, this anatomical lobe used to be referred to as the spinocerebellum. However, that classification has changed somewhat. I'm going to tell you the new classification just now. The anterior anatomical lobe was referred to as the spinocerebellum because it received maximum connections from the spinal cord. The middle of the posterior lobe used to be referred to as the neocerebellum or the cerebrocerebellum, and phylogenetically the newest part of the cerebellum because it has got extensive connections with the cerebral cortex. And the flocculonodular lobe is the phylogenetically the oldest part, and this is referred to as the vestibulocerebellum. Now what we'll do, we will classify the cerebellum according to its current functional classification. For that, I have to include the vermis also in my description. So the current functional classification is as follows. This is the region of the vermis, the midline vermis. It extends from the superior surface and goes all the way to the inferior surface. There we see the vermis deep inside. So this whole vermis is referred to as the vermal region or the spinocerebellum. Vermal region or the spinocerebellum. This whole vermis is concerned with controlling the axial or the truncal musculature and the proximal limb musculature. Now, if we look just on either side of the vermis, approximately where my index finger is located on this side and approximately where my index finger is located on this side, again extending on the superior surface down to the inferior surface. That portion is known as the paravermal region because it is on either side of the vermis. It is also referred to as the intermediate part of the hemisphere, here and here. This is also the spinocerebellum, but this is concerned with controlling the tone of the distal musculature. The distal parts of the limbs, their muscle tone is being controlled. Then we have the remaining part of the cerebral hemispheres, this whole thing here and the whole thing here. This is referred to as the cerebrocerebellum or the neocerebellum or the pontocerebellum. This is the, as I said, the phylogenetically oldest part of it, and this is concerned with most of the activities of the cerebellum, namely motor planning, coordination, volitional movement, fine-tuning, correction of movement errors. All these things are done by the cerebrocerebellum. And finally, the last functional component of the cerebellum is the same one which I had mentioned earlier, the flocculonodular lobe. This is concerned with posture, balance, and smooth pursuit eye movement, and it is also referred to as the vestibulocerebellum. So this is the current functional classification of the cerebellum. Having said the functional classification, let me give you a quick overview of the blood supply of the cerebellum. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, I had to remove the pia mater, and therefore most of the blood vessels have been removed. But to understand the blood supply, we'll have to look at it with the brainstem in its location. This is the medulla, this is the pons, and this is part of the midbrain. So running from here, from the medulla, one blood vessel goes all the way to the back of the cerebellum on the inferior surface. That is known as the PICA, posterior inferior cerebellar artery. It comes from the vertebral artery and it supplies this area. It also supplies the medulla, but we are concerned with the cerebellum right now. Then there's another artery which is also coming from this location in the pons, and it's coming and supplying the inferior but the anterior part of the cerebellum. That is known as the AICA, anterior inferior cerebellar artery. This arises from, this is the first branch of the basilar artery which runs on the basilar groove of the pons. So this is the AICA and this is the PICA. And finally, supplying the superior surface of the cerebellum is an artery which is arising also from the basilar artery but runs like this and supplies the superior surface. That is known as the superior cerebellar artery. So therefore we have the PICA, the AICA and the SCA. These are the three principal arteries of the cerebellum which supplies the cerebellum, and these three arteries are very important. They produce lots of stroke syndromes of the brainstem, but they also produce cerebellar manifestations. Coming to a quick word about the venous drainage. The venous drainage of the cerebellum is best understood by considering the lateral veins and the median veins, superior surface, inferior surface. So the superior lateral veins, they drain into a venous sinus which is running here. That is known as the superior petrosal sinus. The inferior lateral veins, they drain into a venous sinus which is running here. That is known as the inferior petrosal sinus. Coming to the median veins, the superior median vein, it drains into a vein which runs here, that is known as the great cerebral vein of Galen. And finally, the inferior median vein, it drains into a vein which runs here, that is called the straight sinus. So these are the venous drainage of the cerebellum. Now we come to the next part, the peduncles of the cerebellum, which we can see in this specimen here. The cerebellum, as I said in the beginning, is attached to the dorsal aspect of the brainstem, namely the medulla and the pons, and also to the midbrain. It is attached by means of three pairs of pillars. Each pillar is referred to as a peduncle. And because it is attached to the cerebellum, these peduncles are referred to as the cerebellar peduncles. Let's look at the first peduncle, which is easily obvious in this specimen here. The largest and the most prominent peduncle that we see here. This is the middle cerebellar peduncle. As we can see, it is extending all the way from the pons and it is merging into the cerebellum. This is the middle cerebellar peduncle. This is by far the largest peduncle and it carries most of the input to the cerebellum from the cerebral cortex in the form of tracts which are known as the cortico-pontocerebellar tracts. This is the largest input to the neocerebellum, cortico-pontocerebellar tracts through the middle cerebellar peduncle. This connects the pons to the cerebellum. Having said that, now let me show you the inferior peduncle. If we move the medulla to one side, we notice that there is a pillar which is extending up from here. A pillar which is extending up. This is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. This inferior cerebellar peduncle connects the medulla to the cerebellum. And finally, we have the superior cerebellar peduncle. To understand the superior cerebellar peduncle, I have to show you the midbrain. This is the midbrain. So this is the superior cerebellar peduncle. This side, and on this side, this is the superior cerebellar peduncle on this side. This is the superior cerebellar peduncle. So now let's come to what are the structures which are running through the superior, middle and inferior cerebellar peduncle. Middle cerebellar peduncle I've already mentioned. It is the largest input to the cerebellum and the input is the cortico-pontocerebellar tract, the largest input to the neocerebellum. What about the inferior cerebellar peduncle? The inferior cerebellar peduncle carries the spinocerebellar tracts to the cerebellum, the cuneo-cerebellar tracts to the cerebellum. So these are all afferent tracts to the cerebellum, but it also gives rise to a few efferent tracts which are coming out of the cerebellum, namely the vestigio-vestibular tract, the vestigio-reticular tract, and the vestibulocerebellar tract. They also go through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. That is why the inferior cerebellar peduncle has been subdivided into are two components, a restiform body and a juxta-restiform body. The restiform body is the one which gives all the afferents to the cerebellum from the spinal cord. And the juxta-restiform body is the one which brings out the efferents out of the cerebellum, namely the fastigiovestibular and the fastigio-reticular tracts. Coming to the middle cerebellar, superior cerebellar peduncle. The superior cerebellar peduncle is the main outflow. The superior cerebellar peduncle is the main outflow from the deep nuclei of the cerebellum. The deep nuclei of the cerebellum, most important of them is the dentate nucleus. The second largest is the globose emboliform nucleus. They all give their outflow tracts through the cerebellum, through the middle cerebellar peduncle, and these structures, they cross inside the midbrain at a structure which is known as the decussation of the superior cerebellar peduncles, and they go to the opposite side, VL nucleus of the thalamus and the red nucleus of the midbrain, and thereafter they go to many other places. So these are the three pairs of peduncles which connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. Okay, so this is the first part of our dissection, and in the second part of our dissection, I'm going to show you the sagittal view. So, if there are any questions or comments, please put it in the comment section below. Have a nice day.